What happened? Adam got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The whole story of why is not germane to our discussion right now. But once Adam got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, then all of a sudden, everybody began to look at themselves as a separate and distinct entity. And even though at that point in time, and for many years afterwards, everybody still spoke the same language, so there was a certain degree of unity still in existence. But once the story of the Tower of Babel happened, then everybody started speaking different languages, which was very convenient because then you could be a racist, which you couldn't be beforehand. And the entire aura and concept of unity totally passed from the world. And one of the things that's important to understand is that it's obviously impossible within the way this world is structured for all of us to unify together in one body, because we all are disparate human beings. How can we all unify? So the fact of the matter is that any unity can only come through a changing of attitudes, through a changing of where our minds are at. That's where unity has to come from. Because the reality is the true person, the true essence of who you are, is anyway not in your physical self. The true essence of who every single one of us are is in our spiritual selves, in our minds, and in our thoughts. The true unity has to come from working together towards a unification of minds and unification of understanding. Because it's only when we can achieve that, then as we said at the beginning, the only way to truly be prepared to accept the Torah is by bringing ourselves to a state of unity. We got the Torah in order to develop a relationship with God. God is one. If we want that relationship, we have to become one. And I'm going to take this one step further now. See, because I'll bet some of you are sitting there saying, well, I'm ready to unify. They're not ready to unify. It's someone else's fault. But you got to realize that, guess what? As long as you have that attitude in your mind, you're not there yet. Because that means in your mind, there is still a barrier. In your mind, there is still a lack of love. I started off when I was at the beginning of this evening saying that to me this is something which I have had to struggle with very, very much. Because it's taken a lot of work on my part over the last few years. And I'll be the first to admit I got a long way to go to get to that point of really, truly being able to feel love and caring and a sense of oneness with every single Jew and every single human being. And I'll tell you, I got a long ways to go still. It's something which I've got to think about every single last day. There are so many times that I am tempted to feel the exact opposite. Whether it's the blankety-blank jerk behind the counter at the store, whether it's the person of X color or persuasion who's talking on their cell phone while they're driving and getting in my way as a result. There's no lack of people in this world that we can look at and feel a distance from them and an animosity towards them. I don't know how many of you grew up without any feelings of racism whatsoever. I would almost say that if anybody tells me that they grew up without any feelings of racism, I would question your level of honesty, because it's so pervasive and sometimes in ways which we don't even realize in ourselves. So we've all got to stop and think. Why are we here? What does God want from us? You know, the Torah says that you should cleave to Hashem. And the Talmud asks, how can you cleave to God? God is an all-consuming fire. So the Talmud says, just like God is merciful, you be merciful. Just like God does acts of kindness, you do acts of kindness. Just as God clothed the naked, because when Adam and Eve came out of the Garden of Eden, He clothed them. Just as God buries the dead, you bury the dead. You notice one thing? Every single thing that the Talmud is defining for us as the way to cleave to God, these are all acts of chesed. All of them are acts of loving kindness. It doesn't say that you've got to be the strictest person when it comes to kashrus. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't say that you've got to be the strictest person when it comes to your Shabbos observance. Also, that's not a bad thing. But if you want to cleave to God, you want to truly have a relationship with God, every single last thing that the Talmud lists are acts of loving kindness, are acts of chesed. And again, because the reason is that until and unless we are focused on the fact that we've got to have a singular purpose of uniting the world in the service of God, which, by the way, in the Aleinu prayer that we say every single day at the end of our prayers, we speak about that, about uniting the whole world in the service of God. So, what are you doing to unite the world? What are you doing? You know, someone once told me, just a parable that this fellow, after a very stressful day of work, gets onto the subway. And he's sitting over there, he's got a headache, his boss has been impossible all day long, and his wife has called him up 16 times on his cell phone, absolutely driving him nuts. And he finally gets onto the subway, hoping to have a relatively quiet ride back home. And just as he gets on, the next stop, a man gets on with 3 kids. And these kids are just jumping up and down, making an absolute racket. And he's sitting there trying to keep his mouth shut. And just after a few minutes, he can't take it anymore. And he finally turns to the father of these 3 kids and says, "Can you just get your kids to be quiet?" And the man says, "I'm really sorry, but we're on our way home from their mother's funeral." Ooh, all of a sudden, boom. Okay, well, there's that feeling of empathy. When all of a sudden we understand where the other person's coming from and why they're behaving in the manner that they are. One of the things actually that the Torah teaches us is that we are required, when we see people doing things, to give them the benefit of the doubt.